Hey, Shalom Akim, Shalom, Shalom, all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh, Ba'ashem, Yahushai, Ba'ashem, Kakadash. Double honors to the apostles and the elders of Great Millstone for teaching us his truth. And salutations to the sincere Akim and Aquathim and listen. May the blessing of election be upon your house. My name is Brother Roquai. I'm back in here with another quick and Lord's will is always an edifying lesson. And for today's lesson, it's going to be discussing a topic called being spiritually magnetic. And pretty much this lesson was inspired by a conversation I was having with one of the brothers. And basically, in a nutshell, we were along the lines of discussing how a lot of people, and I'll just use men especially in this world, they overly invest in the physical things to make themselves more desirable, right? And also another part to it as well, a lot of them invest in a lot of those same carnal things, the physical things, in essentially to overcompensate for the spiritual things, overcompensate for the things where they lack, overcompensate for, and pretty much use it as a cloak, you know, to kind of hide their the things that they did not work on, right? So this lesson is going to be a little bit tied to the importance of the spiritual things, right? But it's the physical things are merely just a complement. They're not the main focus, right? So what I wanted to do, I guess I'll start off here. And I sincerely pray and hope that this lesson is edifying. I did not write this down, so just bear with me. Just bear with me on this 1 second. So I'm just going to start here. This is 1 Kings chapter 10, verse 1. And it says, and when the queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord, Yahweh Ba'ashem Yahushai, she came to prove him with hard questions. She came to Jerusalem with a very great train, with camels that bear spices and very much gold and precious stones. And when she was come to Solomon, she communed with him of all that was in her heart. Solomon told her all the questions. There was not anything I'll read that again. It says, there was not anything hid from the king, which he told her not. And when the queen of Sheba had seen all Solomon's wisdom, and the house he had built, and the meat of his table, and the sitting of his servants, and the attendance of his ministers, and their apparel, and his cupbearers, and the ascent which he went up unto the house of the Lord, there was no more spirit in her. So essentially she was kind of like floored when she saw, like, oh my goodness, this is how this guy's living. You know, it's kind of like, you know, you meet somebody, or you meet a woman, for example, and the woman probably comes back to your place and she's so like kind of like her jaw's kind of like on the floor, basically, of kind of like how you carry yourself and how you actually conduct yourself, right? She's like, oh my goodness, the sheets are clean, they're folded, the dishes are packed away, you know what I'm saying? She's kind of like marveled at your not just your presence, but she's kind of like floored at, this is wow, she's kind of, like this, like they say in the world, she's breathtaking, right? So it says, this is verse 6, and it says, and she said to the king, it was a true report of that I heard in mine own land of all the acts and of thy wisdom. Howbeit I believed not the words until I came to see with my own eyes, and had seen it. And behold, the half of the half was not told to me. Thy wisdom and prosperity exceeded the fame which I heard. Happy are the men, happy are thy servants, and which stand continually for thee, and to hear thy wisdom. Blessed be the Lord thy power, which delighted in thee to set thee over the throne of Israel, because the Lord hath loved Israel forever, and therefore made he thee king to do judgment and justice, right? So this is during the time of King Solomon's reign, before before he started going off. But the point, I was reading this because this woman, came to see in his quarters and to realize, like, you know, she's not only taken by the physical things, but it was deeply the spiritual things that what she was really, really drawn to. And you can equate the same thing with, people that you might meet also, right? Because, when people look at us on the physical sense, on the physical plane, like the clothes that we wear, or maybe, maybe you have a receding hairline, maybe you have your beard's probably a little bit patchy, something like that, like all these different defects. I don't want to say defects, but you know what I mean. All these different, I guess, so-called blemishes, you can say. But when people are in your presence and they see the way in the manner that which you actually carry yourself, they're basically kind of taken, kind of like how the Queen of Sheba was taken, being in Solomon's presence. You know, seeing how his how decked out, the cupbearers and the attendants and the servants, and how the house of the Lord was. It was so beautified. But what's most important, going back to the real nail in the coffin, to the title of this lesson, is the fact that Solomon, really and truly, he was more decked out in the spirit. All these things were just a byproduct and came after. I'm sure brothers, also have different testimonies, like, because, we're basically, like the lowly, like Paul talks about in First Corinthians, the what's it called, the first chapter. Not many wise men, not many noble men, not many rich men are called, but the Lord, took the foolish things of the world to confound the wise, and he took the mighty things of the world to, as a matter of fact, let me get it, because we're a part of that group of the lowly. We're not, the Diddy's and the Jay-Z's and the Kendrick Lamar's and all these people. Let me just jump straight to the point. This is 1 Corinthians 1 verse 27. But Yahweh hath chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise, and Yahweh hath chosen the weak things of the world to confound the things which are mighty, right? So the Lord didn't choose the what's it called, the mighty things of the world, the different, Goliaths of this world, so to speak, that people have a lot of physical stature. He took essentially the little things of the world to confound the things which are essentially mighty, right? To tear down those strongholds. But the point is, and part of this lesson is the fact that going back to this account here, that Solomon, he was, one of the things, that was one of the first things that he prayed for. He prayed for wisdom. That was most important, and it made him more decked out in the spirit, right? Which is why a lot of the woman was so kind of like flabbergasted. She was so taken by him. And when you think about the nature of a lot of these men in the manosphere world, or even in the world in general, one of their hallmarks is to constantly brag about the things that, and the physical things, I should say, that they have. They don't focus and brag about the things of the spirit. They don't brag about Yahweh Bashim Shai. That's what vastly separates the the regular commoners and the elect of the nation of Israel, right? We strive more to be more decked out in the spirit, and as a byproduct, you will have accounts and examples of people, being drawn to you, kind of like a moth to a flame. There's only light. There's like it's just a sliver of light, and there's like a bunch of flies being drawn to it, because remember, this world is gross darkness, right? So people will be drawn to you because of that light. Let me get this here in Ecclesiastes. This is Ecclesiastes 8, verse 1, and I'll read it in the AMP here, and it says, "Who is like the wise man, and who knows the interpretation of a matter? The man's wisdom illumines his face, or illuminates his face, right? And causes his stern face to beam," right? So that is the exact same thing, the exact same phenomenon what occurs when you're more decked out in the spirit, because and what makes us illuminated is having the understanding of the law, statutes, and commandments, knowing our power, and even knowing our heritage and our history, knowing these prophecies. We have the understanding of an interpretation of these different things. When you look at the what's it called, these so-called podcasters of this world, they don't have the interpretation of these different events and different prophecies that are playing out on the planet Earth as we speak, because the Lord didn't choose them. Going back to the point I brought earlier, the Lord chose the people who are lowly, the people who you don't see on the who you might pass by, right? The meek, the humble, the foolish things of this world, right? Because we are the foolish things of this world, right? So Yahweh Shai even came lowly. He came lowly on an ass, right? That's something, that's part of our, I guess you can say, our countenance, our physical appearance, because we don't look all decked out with driving Ferraris and driving, I mean, if a brother has a Ferrari, but the point is, we're not super, we're clothed in sackcloth, we're in garments of mourning, we don't look like the well dressed or well spoken, and Paul even talks about this too. We don't have that overly polished outward appearance, of what Jake likes to kind of brag about, what these other camps like to brag about, and showing off their righteousness to be essentially be a hallmark of who they are, right? Rather than bragging in Yahweh Bashim Shai, because we know that our righteousness are like the scriptures say, filthy rags, right? Okay, so let me get this here. Okay, let's go to okay, this is Mark chapter 5, going into the point about being magnetic, right? This is Mark chapter 5, verse 25, and it says, "And there was and a certain woman which had an issue of blood 12 years, and suffered many things of many physicians, and had spent all she had, and was nothing bettered, but grew worse. And when she heard of Yahushua, she came into the press behind and touched his garment. For she said, If I may touch but his clothes, I shall be whole. And straightway the fountain of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of that plague. Yahushua immediately, knowing in himself that the virtue had gone out of him, turned him about in the press and said, "Who touched my clothes?" Yahushua said, "Yo, who touched me?" You know what I'm saying? And the disciples said unto him, "Thou seest the multitude thronging thee, and sayest thou, Who touched me?" And looked round about, seeing her that she had that seeing her that done this thing. So essentially, I'm reading this to show that, the power, the spiritual frequency that Yahushua was on, to the point where, a woman just wants to come up to you and touch your clothes, and so that she can be healed, right? She was being what's it called, kind of pulled into him, pulled into, she was being drawn, to Yahushua, because Yahushua had that, you had that virtue, you had that wisdom, that understanding, that power. He was not on a regular level, like a lot of these other, scribes and Pharisees and so on and so forth, right? And what also shows that was when he was in the temple and he was confounding those people who were much, much older than him, right? They were people who were, as a matter of fact, let me get that as well. Because his frequency was just super high to the point where people were just being, being pulled towards him, right? Right, and it's the same thing that happens, when we speak on the highways and byways, because, like, when you really think about it, that's why a lot of these people you might interact with are being drawn towards you, and it's not because of your quote unquote physical appearance, because, like I said earlier, we don't look like people who are quote unquote that have shiny suits, have perfect beards and perfect lineups, and like those kinds of people you might see on like TV, on magazine covers, and so on and so forth. We don't look like that. Going back to the point, we're the lowly, right? Just like Yahushua was, he came lowly, so to speak, right? Let me just get the point. This is I'll just go straight to the point. Luke 2:46. And it came to pass after 3 days they found him in the temple, sitting in the midst of the doctors, both hearing them and asking them questions, and all that heard him were astonished at his understanding and answers, right? So they were, they're being, he was just on a higher frequency, and then being on a higher spiritual frequency, this sorts of that frequency pulls people towards you, right? We don't go after and trying to super, deck ourselves out in the flesh to try and what's it called, impress the people of this world, because we are not of this world. The fashion of this world passes away, right? The Apostle Kabar, he did a lesson in regards to so-called alpha males, and Yahushua being like the top alpha male, pretty much. It shows that wisdom. First, it shows that wisdom really and truly is the principal thing, because there's a vast difference between when you hear people of this world speak, because when the things that they brag about the things that are carnal, they brag about the things that are physical, they brag about the things that are essentially tangible. They don't brag about things that are eternal. They don't speak about things that are like, when it comes to virtue and character and affection, and temperance, these different virtues that you read about you can find them in Colossians, I think it's the 3rd chapter, and even I think it's 2 Peter is the 1st chapter. Also, those different virtues and so on and so forth. When the scriptures talk about putting on, therefore, the elect, They don't, you can't find those things, amongst that manosphere crowd. It's always the same talking points with the same bimbo women, with the same, it's just, everything is just the same. It's dull, right? Isaiah 13:12, and it says, I will make a man more precious than fine gold, even a man than the golden wedge of Ophir, right? So, an elect man would be very, very precious in those days, because he actually would have, not just an intimate relationship with Yahweh Bashem Shai, but would have a an understanding of prophecies of what's actually going on, right? He'd be very, very valuable. What he was like if you think about the story of like Elijah during that time of the famine, Elijah was a man, a high value man in that moment, because he was able to, through the Spirit of the Lord, he was able to bring the woman's son back to life, right? So it shows you that wisdom is really the principal thing, and it also shows you there's benefits to being more spiritually decked out, right? And this is not to knock the physical, the physical things, because a lot of us, we like nice things, right? We like, certain brothers have different appetites, have different, tastes, and so on and so forth. This is not to knock the carnal, but what I am knocking is the sentiment that the overemphasis of the carnal, like how you see a lot of all the other camps, for example, the way that they conduct themselves, they conduct themselves as pretty much as whited sepulchres, right? As Yahushua said, you're like whited sepulchres, but on the inside it's like dead men's bones. There's no substance, there's no living waters inside of you. There's just cobwebs, right? So pretty much that was pretty much the as a matter of fact, I guess I'll end off with this one. Go to Philippians, the second chapter. This is the 15th verse, and it says that ye may be blameless and harmless, sons of the Most High, without rebuke, in the midst of a crooked and perverse nation. Among them ye shine as lights in the world. Right? Let me get that word. Let me see what it means when it says shine. Oh, sorry. It says, bring forth into the light, cause to shine, shed light. It says, to become more evident, to be brought to the light, right? It says, become clear or manifest. And Yahushua said that ye are the light of the world, a city that is set upon a hill that cannot be hid, right? So, when we see these things and marvel at these things, we give all credit and praises and honor to Yahweh Bashem Shai, right? So, that's pretty much it. I didn't want to make the lesson too long. This is just a little bit of exhortation to focus on the spiritual riches, right? And because that causes us to be more spiritually magnetic, right? People will be drawn to you, because you're more decked out in the spirit, rather than, if you're decked out in the flesh. I can't really, knock that, but just to overemphasize being more decked out in the spirit, really, right? Because that way you're able to even discern also, who's really just trying to be your friend, and who's just, pretending, so to speak, who seems to be genuine. That's actually a good test, to be honest with you, to dress, as somebody who actually doesn't got it, right? Rather than to pretend to be someone who, who has a lot of money, right? And, that helps to discern, between the type of people that you come across, right? So anyways, I'll just leave it there, but, hopefully Lord's will, this lesson was edifying. I just like to give all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh Bashem Shai. Until next time, I say Shalom.